Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Vortex, where lies and falsehoods are trapped and exposed. I'm Michael Voris. With the civilization in its death throes, many people start scrambling around looking for what we guess you could call the easy out. As a point of reference, when the Roman Empire was breathing its last and the barbarians were swarming over the walls and marauding down the streets, the citizenry thought it was the end of the world. And remember, when all of that was going on, most of the empire had already been either directly converted to Catholicism or at least understood it was the state religion and had been at that point for over a century. So we're not exactly talking about a bunch of pagans here worshiping false gods out in the forests. In fact, so horrified and end-of-the-world crazy were they that St. Augustine sat down and penned his tremendous work, The City of God, still one of the giants classics of Western civilization and, dare we say, human history. In that opus of his, he drew the sharp distinction between the city of God and the city of man. The faithful belong to the city of God and simply dwell temporarily in the city of man. We are citizens of the heavenly city, and what happens in the earthly city should not be considered paramount. That's how his counsel went. Empires and civilizations come and go, but the city of God remains. Well, approximately 15 centuries later, with various empires having arisen and fallen over those centuries, here we are again. And right on cue, the end of the world with variations, crazies, are at it again. In the Catholic world, it takes the form of almost Gnostic prophecies from centuries earlier, shoehorned into our contemporary days, and little-known apparitions and isolated mystics and so forth. But one that never seems to die the death it so richly deserves is the absolute nutty Protestant crap about the rapture. For those unfamiliar with it, or only in passing, in short, the rapture is an anti-biblical belief that before the end of the world, all those who have believed in Jesus or still walk around on earth alive will be sucked up from the earth and taken up in the skies into heaven. And then all of those left behind will have to deal with the calamity. They made this great big series, Left Behind, about all that. The idea has been around for a couple hundred years in Protestant circles, but because it has no basis in Scripture, unless you go to great pains to twist and distort sacred Scripture, there are multiple contradictory beliefs within Protestantism about the rapture and what flows from it. For example, there are huge discussions raging right now in more fundamentalist and some evangelical circles about how a believer should live his life based on which version of the rapture or the tribulation or millennialism, and all of that is correct. And no, we aren't kidding you. You should live your life differently as a Christian based on which particular category you believe in. That's completely nutty. Here's a sample from one very popular social media fellow. But first, a warning. Prepare to have your head spinning when this is done. Here's the quote. The question on my mind at this point is which eschatological position is correct? The answer to this question impacts everything about how a Christian ought to live his life in these wicked days. I'll explain. If post-millennialism is correct, the NWO, the New World Order itself, is a psyop. The elites are likely using the book of Revelation as a playbook to psyop the masses into hopelessness, and we both can and should overcome this evil. If pre-millennialism is correct, then the next question I have is whether the rapture is pre-trib, mid-trib, or post-trib. That trib refers to tribulation. Each possibility carries significant implications for how a Christian should live his life in these final days. Pre-tribulation or mid-tribulation rapture means our time is best spent witnessing the gospel to as many people as humanly possible right now. Literally nothing else matters, in my opinion. Post-tribulation rapture would mean our time would be best spent witnessing the gospel, but also preparing to be cut off from the global economy and to have war waged against us. Big implication for parents, especially. Which eschatological position is correct? Important to pray for clarity on this. Okay, did you get all that? Seriously, a large group of Protestants actually are consumed with all this nonsense. The last point that is important to pray for clarity on which eschatological position is correct. That is true, but it's already been answered. None of that is correct. It's based on faulty. All of it is based on faulty and bad personal interpretations of Scripture. Thank you very much there, Martin Luther, who unleashed the ghouls from this Pandora's box. There's a reason that for 1,700 years or so, no one who called themselves Christian, 1,700 years, 1,700 years, no one ever even thought of all of this, much less broke down into multiple contradictory positions about it, because it's not true. None of it. The underlying assumption itself is wrong. Once again, we see the fault lines in the Protestant heresy. There is no final authority when it comes to Scripture interpretation, and so this nonsense is the logical conclusion of that. Like those eyes in him. Luther blew up Scripture and created an environment where any ramblings from any nut job with a persuasive personality could be considered learned or authoritative. Take the one point of the rapture, for example. St. Paul uses the term as it related to a specific practice common in the ancient world. The Protestants skip over this point. That when a king, an emperor, a great general, whoever, was returning to the city after a triumphal military campaign, some of the citizens would leave the city and go out to meet him and his army and escort them back into the city where the celebration would break out. That movement, so to speak, out of the city to greet the victor and then return to the city with him was called, loosely translated, the rapture. We did an entire episode on this topic back in the day of our One True Faith series, which is normally a premium show, but for this Vortex, we're offering it for free. All you have to do is just click on that provided link right there. We have to be honest and say there is a flavor of this approach in some Catholic circles as well today, although it's not specifically about the rapture. But these notions and concepts surrounding various prophecies and apparitions, some of them even unapproved, by folks who don't do a lot of critical thinking, meaning they don't discern the spirits very well, as St. Paul urged us to do. Such as the byproduct, one of many, of a crumbling civilization. People start going out of their minds. Be sure not to be taken in by all of this theo-hysteria and chasing about for signs and wonders. The best approach is always the authentically Catholic approach, as St. Augustine laid out. And one last major point, you need to really consider this, perhaps the most important point really, it's pretty simple. Who cares if it's the end of the world or not? If it is, then it is, and ain't nothing you and I can do about it. If it isn't, well, your world is going to end, my world is going to end. One way or the other, we're each going to be going to our judgments. That's why what you should be concentrating on is not crazy anti-biblical ideas that have no power to save because they're totally wrong, but your own personal holiness. God love you. I'm Michael Voris.